Well, I'm very happy to be here participating in a symposium about this wonderful exhibition at the museum. Listening to the first two speakers has made me reflect a little bit on the position of contemporary ink painting in the world today, and I'd like to begin with a few comments about that. Ink painting has garnered a lot of attention in recent years, particularly in the Asian art departments of major museums in the West. So, for example, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts a few years ago had an exhibition called Fresh Ink. The Chinese title was more about reflecting on the past, which is what the exhibition really turned out to be about, just as the present exhibition, as Mike Hearn mentioned, is more about connecting with the past than it is about ink per se. The British Museum also had an exhibition of contemporary ink painting a couple years ago, as did the Musée Guimet. In China also, ink painting, contemporary ink painting is becoming a very hot subject. There are endless exhibitions all year round. And artists are sort of emerging from the woodwork, some of them known for working in other media, but picking up the brush and saying that they're now ink painters. I guess my talk today is going to be a bit of a plea for a respect to traditional values in ink painting. When you see ink painting in a museum like the Metropolitan, when you see the historical ink painting, it's been weeded out over centuries. And experts over the years have determined what is good, what is worthy of being in a museum collection, and what is not so worthy. Much of it has sort of fallen by the wayside. This is one of the problems with considering contemporary ink in a scholarly fashion. The connoisseurship has not really been done yet. So who knows what will turn out in a couple hundred years from now to be the great monuments of ink painting today. In a place like the Asian art departments of the Metropolitan, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Musée Guimet, the British Museum, the curators selecting the works of contemporary ink painting really know what they're doing. So the works that they choose to display are works that really stand up to the connoisseurial desiderata of the past. But in a great many exhibitions, the ink painting hasn't been vetted in this way. And so there is not there's not this expert discrimination of what really will stand the test of time. And so today, the point of my paper is to point out what I consider three very important aspects of traditional ink painting, things that I hope will not be lost, or that will be reconsidered, or that will somehow find more widespread appreciation in the contemporary art realm. First of all, with ink painting of the past, art language was supremely important, much more so than depicting something that can be seen or conveying a straightforward idea that could perhaps be transmitted just as well verbally. Second, the materials of ink painting, ink, brush, and paper, have an extremely sophisticated symbiotic relationship that makes them superlative artistic tools when used together. Third, the first 2 points enable a profound philosophical and experiential relationship to exist between artist, work of art, and viewer. So point number 1, the supreme importance of art language. Ink painting and calligraphy have been the primary fine arts of China for over 1,000 years, with landscape painting the leading genre. During the 20th century, however, that long history was interrupted in mainland China by powerful external forces that left a long-lasting confusion in their wake. These forces are, essentially, the politically motivated devaluation of traditional ink painting, paired with the displacement of landscape painting by figure painting as the leading genre. Plus, an additional, less politically driven factor, the premium placed by society, including artists, upon the new. Prior to the 20th century, landscape was the elite genre. The landscape itself was not, however, the artist's subject. And as I'm sure you can see with this image, this is not a real landscape. It's not possible for this to be a real landscape. It's a kind of imaginary image that represents something about the cosmos. And here, Professor Wu Hong mentioned Shirtao and his dots. The dots really they're about dots. They're not giving you any truly useful information about the landscape. It's an expressive tool, and the artist's enjoying the ink play. He's concerned with the language of art, not with what he's on the surface representing. Artists and theorists scorned mimesis to such an extent that as early as the 11th century, the scholar Su Shi wrote, "If anyone discusses painting in terms of formal likeness, his understanding is nearly that of a child." Instead of seeking likeness, the artist's concern was to use the landscape form as a vehicle through which to express a sense of self in communication with the Tao, or the grand cosmos, and to engage in a dialogue with artists of past, present, and future about the language of brush and ink. This interpretation of landscape, instigated in the Song dynasty and fully implemented in the Yuan, had continuously evolved over the course of centuries, arriving at its zenith as an immensely sophisticated means of artistic expression. The mind landscape persisted as the dominant genre until it received a shock in the 19th century when confronted by the imported Western imperative of realism, as Professor Andrews so beautifully illustrated. During the Maoist era, this centuries-lived understanding of the centrality of art language to art was decimated. Mao Zedong said that art was to be created for the workers, peasants, and soldiers. It was to be based on an understanding of the struggles people faced and executed in a manner that they could comprehend. Furthermore, its goal was to support ongoing revolution. Under these precepts, traditional ink landscape painting was prescribed as bourgeois liberal, and socialist realist figure painting imported from the Soviet Union in oil or acrylic on canvas rose to be the dominant genre. This had a devastating effect on Chinese art, and you can see here the result in the ink. So this is ink painting used in a socialist realist manner. Propagandistic figure painting is readily comprehensible, as Mao required. It is an exaggerated mode of storytelling. The figure is key, and basically, the content functions on the surface. What you see is what you get. And as an aside here, I would observe that as a lasting effect, much contemporary Chinese art in every medium, and including conceptual art, has very straightforward content, often a superficial narrative. Thus, in mid-20th century Chinese art, the landscape as a kind of non-subject, ink as a prime medium, and art's deep philosophical underpinnings all fell by the wayside, upheld sporadically and sometimes secretively by an older generation, but rarely passed on. Contemporary Chinese ink painting embraces a plethora of styles, ink application techniques, subjects, formats, and even media. two circumstances have combined to catalyze this enormous diversity. First, the awareness and availability of an unprecedented variety of options, developed mostly during the 20th century. And second, the high value contemporary China places on change. Broadly speaking, in art there are two major routes to the new: innovation in answer to a creative need, and innovation commanded by an outside force. Innovation as an inevitable aspect of creation. Every artist is different, and even if it were considered desirable, it is not possible exactly to replicate what has already been produced. A sophisticated explication of the former, more organic kind of innovation is Shirtao's philosophy of Yifa, or one method, and subsequently Yihua, the primordial line. These theories describe a system of artistic growth whereby the painter generates something new through continually internalizing, adapting, and synthesizing everything that has gone before. The second kind of innovation, that produced in response to an outside force, can result from the demands of a new patron or patronage class. An example would be Mao's call for artists to create art in service of the revolution. A newly powerful outside force, seductive rather than commanding, took hold in the late 20th century. The belief that innovation or change is valuable in and of itself. Calls for modernization, either in the name of serving the state or for the purpose of answering innovations in the international art world, catalyzed several deliberately engineered waves of change in 20th century Chinese ink painting. Contemporary mainland China is permeated by an abiding faith in progress, upheld by the dramatic changes witnessed in everyday life. Progress is not only a part of life, it is a major component of government policy. Since Deng Xiaoping inaugurated his reform and opening policy in 1978, broad goals of the central government have included economic growth, improved domestic living standards, and heightened international standing. And this is a photograph by Shi Guorui, who has a piece in the exhibition of Shenzhen with the billboard of Deng Xiaoping representing the move to progress. And I like this because it represents kind of the dark force of progress. Progress in terms of culture includes government support for art exhibitions to be sent overseas and a massive flurry of museum building with plans to construct 1,000 new museums. A vague concept of progress also exists as a general goal for art. While the downside of blind faith in progress is obvious in daily life, the pollution and so on is readily apparent, little is made of the downside of the concept of progress as a goal for art. And there often are conferences or papers or things expressing the idea of progress or fajian in art. I was at a calligraphy conference and everyone was talking about shufa fajian, calligraphy progress, which just seemed like you were lumping art in with economic things as somehow similar. For 100 years, a quest for innovation appropriate to the times has been a driving force of ink painting, not just in mainland China, but in Greater China. Innovation has unfolded in many guises, including reinventing from within, incorporating new techniques, serving the nation, and responding to international art trends. And I show this as an example of ink painting that has not turned into propaganda, but that is incorporating Western chiaroscuro, anatomical awareness, and so on. And I like to show this painting because it's a major piece by an important artist, but very few people know that it exists. Here's a detail of the water. It's a marble technique. So this is just a kind of obscure example of ways in which artists were trying new ways of using ink. This was painted in Italy, where they do paper marbling. The possibilities for ink are vast, so vast now as to leave a sense of confusion regarding the qualities on which ink painting can or should be judged. Furthermore, the sources available for inspiration are much greater than ever before due to the explosion in the quantity and accessibility of reproductions of works of art in books, magazines, and the internet. Everything is instantly available for viewing, and popular culture has accelerated the leveling in the value of visual images. Unlike a century ago, it is no longer possible to presuppose a shared familiarity with a body of ink painting masters or masterworks. Nor is it possible to assume that ink painters will consider technical facility with the brush a prerequisite to the creation of important works of art. There's a crisis of direction and of judgment of quality, and I feel this cannot be overstated. My second point, ink as a medium. While I find a meaningful relationship between ink painting and certain works of art created in other media, including photography, video, performance, oil painting, and installation, to the extent that Shen Kuei and I chose to include such works in the 2007 Chengdu Biennial, which focused on ink. I believe a great deal is lost when the central qualities of ink painting, those qualities that enabled it to endure for so many centuries, are no longer utilized fully by artists, nor understood by viewers. Those qualities are the relationship between ink, brush, and paper, as well as the philosophy of the relationship of the artist to the work of art and to the world. These remarkably sophisticated relationships are entirely relevant to the present day. The most sophisticated traditional ink painting relies on a harmony of materials perfected centuries ago. The triumvirate of ink, Maobi, the Chinese hair or fur brush, and Xuan paper. Since the Tang Dynasty, Xuan paper has been produced in Anhui, the home of the four treasures of the scholar's studio: brush, ink, paper, and inkstone. Paper comes in different absorbencies, calculated to observe the ink as required by the artist, and the artist can temper the absorbency through application of sizing. Xuan paper improves with age, so many artists buy paper when they are young to use when they are old. Ink is a very basic material, carbon bound with animal glue. The Maobi, the brush, is perfectly designed to hold and to release evenly a well of ink stored in the middle of the brush end. The Maobi's handle is round, and artists are taught to hold the brush in such a way that through minute adjustments of the fingers, the brushstroke can be directed in myriad ways. Decades of training result in a mastery of the brush retained as motor memory. In wielding the brush, no conscious action is required. The sensitivity of the brush movement to the slightest impulses of the artist's fingers, combined with the sensitivity of the Xuan paper to the ink, mean that the artist transmits his or her impulse directly to the paper. This is the key to traditional ink painting, and this requires patience and training to master. Once mastered, however, it is an extremely powerful tool. And I'm going to show a very simple example of this. One of these paintings is genuine, two are fake. I don't know, some of you can probably guess which is the genuine one. The artist, here, if you look at the tails and the swell of the body, you can see that on the left, the artist conveys directly through the brush the swelling of the animal's body and the sinuous, ropey nature of the tail. And the other two, for the tail, the artist is just basically making a line. He's not got the idea of the tail in his mind. Such a splendid tool should be relevant to artists in any time and place. In terms of Western art, we appreciate the brushstrokes of painterly artists such as Rubens, as well as the hands of master draftsmen, as revealed in the twists and turns of pencil on paper in combination with varied pressure on the implement. But if those artists had been skillfully using Chinese ink, brush, and paper, their lines would be much more revealing. And here we have Rubens using oil on oak. You can see that he has the idea, you press down, for example, at the curve where the horse's neck meets the chest, and it gives you a sense of the roundness where the shape sort of changes direction. So he basically, he's got some of the ideas that Chinese painters have when they're using the brush, when to push down, when to turn, but the tool he's using isn't as sophisticated as the Chinese brush. Ink is expressive, and inevitably there is a performative aspect to painting. So here, this artist, Wang Peng, did a performance where he printed with his body covered in ink onto Xuan paper. And you certainly can get a sense of the emotional tenor of the artist at the moment. On the left, he's painting with his hair on paper, which is something that the early Mo Shang artists did. And now on the right, it's just a body print. Well, if you put ink on paper with your body, you can convey this much. Surprisingly, you also can do so just painting lines. Li Huasheng, as has been mentioned, spent a year painting this set of 4 paintings, painting the lines as evenly as he possibly could. And he says during the decade or so, when he painted these line grid paintings, he was very unsocial. He didn't go out much. He mostly stayed inside and painted lines, which is, a very meditative practice. But he also says, and he'll show you on his paintings, in some places he can remember what was happening when he painted a certain area of the painting, because the lines are less even. So even when trying to paint as even and straight a line as possible, the brush will convey something of the artist's spirit at the time. Other things you can sometimes pick up from painting. This painter did this painting when he's quite old. You can sometimes get a sense of a painter's age from the brush and ink. With Yang Jiecheng's Crying Landscape series, he is using brush and ink here to express, ironically, his ideas about the landscape, the tragedy of the landscape expressed as something absolutely gorgeous. Or here he's expressing an idea much more directly. He's conveying a sense of horror. This is part of his series of works about the massacre in Tiananmen Square. The Communist Party didn't pay the bill, and the skulls and bones have this kind of horrible quality to them. So the brush gesture can carry both expressive and conceptual content. My third point, that the philosophical and experiential relationship between artists, work of art, and viewer is very important. The philosophical underpinnings of Chinese painting at its height hold long-lasting relevance. A key concept is the notion of qi yun, or spirit resonance. If we think back to the example of Qi Baishi and the water buffalo, the artist is in a state of resonance with the animal, or his idea of the animal. And he transmits that idea to the paper through his hand and brush. A viewer may then be in resonance with Qi Baishi's image, leading indirectly back to the idea of the animal in the artist's mind. The same idea with these skulls here. The artist had a certain idea that he's expressing, and by contemplating these works, we get a direct sense of what the artist is thinking. It's not, words aren't needed. It's a direct connection. And the same idea with this painting by Guo Xi. His landscape is much more a transmission of experience than of place, or a transmission of a state of mind. And I also believe that this is not limited to ink painting. This is a very large photograph, and it impresses the viewer. You get, I think, an idea of what the artist had in mind when creating the work. And with Qiu Shi Hua, you really need to stand in front of the painting and open your mind, become a passive receiver of what's in the painting before the image will emerge. So in a way, particularly this painting demonstrates that trying to actively get the content out of the work of art doesn't work as effectively as opening yourself to a direct communication. We can say that the ultimate point of many of these paintings is to transmit an understanding of the artist's relationship with nature, or we can say with the Tao through this experience of yun. And here I have a quote to read. Creation is dominated by three absolutely different factors. First, nature affects us by its laws. Second, the artist who creates a spiritual contact with nature and with his materials. And third, the medium of expression through which the artist translates his inner world. This quote relates in my mind to a way of using the concept of yun to more directly experience or channel an experience of the Tao. This is if the artist facilitates the media's expression of their nature as purely materials. So what am I talking about? In this painting, this artist, Zhang Chongbin, trained as a figure painter, but he's recently been experimenting with setting up situations in which the final work of art is not entirely under his control. This is nothing new in art in other media, but it seems particularly fruitful with ink on paper. So it's a big deal, actually, for many of these artists that you see, and also particularly for the artists painting in black. They've gone through years, decades of training in how to use the brush, and they decide to set that training aside to do something different. People, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it's a very big deal for an artist to set aside all this training to do something else. But Zhang Chongbin is taking a kind of kernel of an idea from ink painting. He semi-controls the materials and lets kind of nature work on them so that the materials are expressing themselves. The quote I read was by the painter Hans Hofmann, who belonged to the wave of artists in Europe and the United States who were inspired either directly or indirectly by Japanese Zen, which of course goes back to China. This way of thinking was extremely important to 20th century art, and this artist, Zhang Chongbin, has come to this way of thinking through decades of experimenting with his chosen media. So in conclusion, I believe that while ink is inspiring Chinese artists to new heights of expression, at the same time, the focus on art at the periphery of the ink realm may be distracting from a clear view of ink painting. Let's keep in mind the basic, long-lived elements of Chinese ink painting. Find ways to develop those being the art language of great importance, making full use of the advantages of ink and brush and paper together with highly developed skill in their use, and finally, an appreciation of the sophisticated relationship that can exist between subject, artist, painting, and viewer. Contemporary Chinese ink painters and calligraphers are doing new things. Even Chinese historical painting theory can be adapted to suit the times. So I don't think it's possible in the near future, or ever probably, to exhaust the possibilities of ink on paper.